Hello, everyone. Thank you for braving the weather. I want to thank the Free Thought Society, their founder, Margaret, for bringing the Tree of Knowledge here. A few years ago, I think she told me this is our 9th year, so we'll have a big celebration next year for our 10th. And it represents, in part at least, one of the greatest human activities, which is storytelling. The book covers that are soon going to be all over that tree, hung from its branches, are of many types of stories, biographies from famous people to slave narratives. There are stories about the fight for freedom of conscience, as well as battles for justice. There are stories of our natural world, human creation stories about the transformation of insentient matter into conscious creatures who build civilizations and tell stories. Now, these humanist stories of transformation and transcendence don't involve a supernatural being or magical powers. They're stories that are uniquely and humbly human. And in these narratives, human beings rely on our nature-given talents, and we rely on each other. Both the Free Thought Society and the Ethical Society share a commitment to doing good. We agree with what Robert Ingersoll, the great agnostic, once said, that hands that help are far better than lips that pray. In a world of suffering and need, it's what we do to alleviate that suffering and need that matters most. And that's why the Free Thought Society, for example, has a Helping Hands Committee that matches people in need with people who are happy to help. Now, today I'm going to explore some of the links between serving others and storytelling. And I'll start by remembering that way back at my high school, at least, every academic day we had a 25-minute period that was called a jobs period, in which the students would either sweep a hallway or clean a blackboard. And it was, I thought at the time, there to remind us, not that we had to have a clean learning environment, although it might have done a little bit of that, but mainly to remind students of the importance of contributing to the common good. Now, when I became a young teacher at Edinburgh School, I was appointed community service director, and I continued that assumption. Service was a means to instill in my students civic responsibility. But it usually felt like the students saw it just as a requirement that they had to check off. Some students did say it was rewarding. In fact, some even continued beyond the 60 hours that they were required to get done by the time they graduated. And it seemed a valuable part of their education. But there was resistance by many students and parents and even faculty members who asked in some way why it was important. They said, why do we have to do community service? What's the point? And it might have been wisest for me at that point to give the simplest answer, to just say, because it's the right thing to do. But I didn't do that. I tried to justify the service as a fundamental part of their child's education. I said that if their children learn to act altruistically now and then, that it would be important to them, that if they focused on the good of others and not exclusively on their own advancement, that they would in fact have a more rewarding life for them. Personal sacrifice for others would in the end serve them. And I used a quote from Martin Luther King that I love, contains a lot of wisdom. Everybody can be great because everyone can serve. Now, every once in a while, some of my more philosophically students would come back to me and say, if the purpose of service is to promote altruism, and altruism is sacrifice, then is serving so as to live a more rewarding life not really service? Aren't we just using the needs of others to further ourselves and make ourselves feel better? These were some smart kids. And it got me wondering whether volunteering is simply a way to feel good about ourselves. I mean, how much credit should we give to ourselves in a world of desperate need for going to a soup kitchen once a month? I wonder sometimes if I became involved in ethical culture because I wanted to feel like I was an ethical person. These kind of questions can lead to almost a paralyzing doubt at times. Now, today I'm going to try to counter this paralysis. I'm going to discuss 3 aspects of storytelling related to volunteering. The importance of being heard, the art of listening, and how stories transform relationships. And this transformation is part of my commitment to serve others in need. So let me start with being heard. One of the most underappreciated ways to serve others is simply to let them be heard. And it counters what some people talk about today as a almost chronic loneliness that exists in our world. Although social media crowds out our lives and we live in increasingly crowded places, people seem to be more and more lonely. This was true even a century ago when the German sociologist George Simmel observed, "One nowhere feels as lonely and lost as in the metropolitan crowd." Mark Robinson, who heads one of Britain's largest charities that works with older people, said that loneliness actually kills many seniors. He cited research about how loneliness is more deadly than smoking 15 packets of cigarettes a day. He actually said that. Maybe. Great Britain is addressing this epidemic through a ministry called the Ministry of State for Sport, Media, and Creative Industries. Theresa May, when she was Prime Minister, called the head of that ministry the Minister for Loneliness. There's a nonprofit that started in California called Sidewalk Talk. It was founded by Tracy Rubel, a social worker, and she knew that people all over this country didn't necessarily go to therapy due to feeling some sort of shame or the cost or the time. So she set up chairs on the sidewalks, offering people an opportunity to speak to trained volunteers, just so they could be heard. And this is happening in 50 cities around this country. Loneliness can particularly affect those who live on the margin. Many homeless men, women, and children feel abandoned in this world. Many unemployed people feel that nobody cares. Those who are forcibly separated from society, those who are incarcerated, for example, often feel worthless. Isolation makes redemption harder. It blocks people from trying to rebuild their lives and contribute back to society again. There's an organization that reaches out to incarcerated people called the Listener Scheme. They set up one-on-one dialogues so that prisoners are heard and can bring meaning back to their lives. My friend Randy Best, who is now the leader of the Northern Virginia Ethical Society, was involved in a program at a prison where he visited an inmate by the name of Kwame Teague. He was somebody who claimed he was unjustifiably sentenced to life in jail. And Randy said that for Kwame, they were working on a project to allow humanist chaplains into prisons, because they are not currently allowed in North Carolina. But he said the most important thing for Kwame was that Kwame felt heard. He felt like he mattered. Now, most inmates don't have that sort of lifeline to the outside world because the system makes it so difficult for people to visit. The suicide rate of inmates is 4 times higher than those outside of prisons. And even when they're released back into society, they can feel like outsiders marked with a scarlet letter, unable to get a job or government services, and they fall back often into addiction and crime and then end up back in jail. Now, to counter this, the interfaith organization that I'm involved with down in Baltimore called BUILD has a program called Turnaround Tuesdays, and its co-director, Terrell Williams, will be speaking at the Baltimore Society in February. And he knew firsthand what it was like when he was incarcerated and then a returning citizen, because as an ex-offender, he felt branded by everybody as being unreliable, untrustworthy, and he struggled to finish his education, to get a job. But in a way, he began to tell his story so that it transformed his life. He changed a story of mistakes and failure into a story of persistence and success. And now at weekly turnaround Tuesday meetings, the attendees are taught to tell their story. Because if not, they're told others are going to tell it for you, and not in ways that serve you. Terrell uses a term, he says, he encourages those who attend Turnaround Tuesdays to make your pain your purpose. By sharing the pain of their struggles through personal narratives, Terrell explains to them that they can reclaim their lives. He tells them, you can't really hide your mistakes in life because they're going to follow you to that job interview. But you can have a fresh start. So they do these little sessions where for 2 minutes they tell each other their stories. And those who mumble and have their head down and tell it in a way that is not full of pride and hope are coached to tell it in a new way, to say it with enthusiasm, so it becomes a tale of redemption. And this storytelling often transforms people, their personality, into one where they can find their liberation. Now, thanks to Betsy, one reason why we're splitting our cash donations today with Books Through Bars is because this is a nonprofit out on Baltimore Avenue which donates 2,000 books to people in jail a month. And they also have an educational and empowerment program called Address This, which reaches out to incarcerated citizens, and particularly those in solitary confinement, and it encourages them to tell their stories, to write them out. This has led to a collection of stories in zine publications about prison life and their struggle to get reconnected to society. And just this alone helps them feel more invested in the world. And it encourages them to re-engage and transform their yearning and their isolation and their confusion and pain into a fuller life. So when you give, when we pass the plate, please think of that and be as generous as you can, because being heard makes a difference. Well, listening, because every storyteller needs a listener. I think that's what makes a full story. Listening is not always easy because most of us are pretty busy and impatient, focused on the next task we've got to do. I know I fall into that pattern way too often. I don't always listen as deeply as I should. Stephen Covey, who wrote that 7 Habits of Highly Effective People, said that, quote, most people do not listen with the intent to understand, they listen merely with the intent to reply. And our caretakers sometimes fall prey to this. I remember one time I took one of my children to the health clinic. They had a fever, and a new doctor came in, and she was looking at her iPad, and she said the name of my child, and then began to read some of her notes, and then asked us some questions, and then typed them into her pad without looking at us. It was weird. And when she finally did look and examine my son, it seemed like we were just a nuisance in her way. And I have empathy for them because there's such pressure to get through it. And all the electronic gadgets almost gets in the way of the human interaction. We were never able to tell our story. Listening is a skill that's only recently been really taught in medical schools, but it is being taught more and more and in other lines of work. You know the term active listening. That's been called that way in social work for a while. And it's about being fully present, and it involves little cues like looking people in the eye and nodding and repeating some of their phrases back, and then asking them if what you heard was this and getting confirmation back. And that's a skill, and it builds trust. Social worker Patricia Smith emphasizes that in a therapeutic relationship, listening, really listening, she says, to the person sitting in front of you makes all the difference. She explains, in today's busy world of technology, doing more, pressures to meet deadlines, a client's need to be listened to is sometimes rushed, end quote. But active listening lets the speaker know it's okay to vent. It's okay to vent. It tells the listener that you have empathy for them, that you want to understand how they feel. And most of all, the listener stops thinking, what's wrong with this person? and starts thinking, what happened to this person? People who are in need and lonely and scared are often somewhat healed when they're heard. This is central to hospice work. Mike Providence, who manages a training service for hospice workers, said that the primary thing we're looking for is people who are really good listeners. It's the most critical skill for this type of work. Because clearly some of the saddest stories I've heard are people who are at the end of life and they feel like they're in the way, that nobody wants to be part of listening to their story. They feel a burden. Some research even shows that medical professionals unconsciously spend less time with patients who are dying because they don't want to be reminded of what they might think of as failure. But more and more medical professionals are accepting that dying is a part of life, an important part that they need to work with. A number of chaplains I know who work in hospitals say that most of their clients don't care what faith tradition they came from, if any of them. It doesn't matter if they can say the rosary. They just want to be heard. When they speak, they want someone to listen. And when they don't speak, they want someone to just sit with them. It shows that they matter. Now, Jane Addams, the settlement house worker, one of my ethical inspirations, had to learn how to listen to people rather than just rushing in to judge them and then fix them. There was a well-known example in Hull House where there was a rumor circulating in the neighborhood that a devil baby had been born, complete with horns and a curse for a father who had done something wrong. But rather than mocking those who were passing along this seemingly irrational myth or dismissing the gawkers who wanted to see the child, Jane Addams listened to them in order to understand the myth and understand the need behind it. Addams said, "Whenever I heard the eager voices of the old women, I was irresistibly interested and left anything I might be doing in order to listen to them." I found a dissertation online by Mike Joyce of Southern Illinois University. I was attracted because he linked the work of Jane Addams to a sociologist, philosopher I didn't know, Hans Georg Gadamer, and it talked about three types of listening. You've probably heard things like this: listening for, listening to, and listening with. You can guess where this is going. Listening for is actually not really listening at all, but listening for my time to speak. And at cocktail parties, you just see this, right? People are telling a story, and everybody else is getting ready for it. I can beat that. Listening to somebody at least brings that person before your consciousness, but nevertheless still sees them as an object outside of yourself, separate from and independent of you. But listening with, however, is a deeper form of listening in which the listener not only hears the speaker, but develops empathy for them. It asks the listener to imagine being in the place of the person telling the story. So in the case of the devil baby, Jane Addams tried to get inside the minds of the people propagating the myth to understand why they were doing it. Joyce says that Addams, quote, realized that the older women were using the story for a purpose. They were attempting to speak the truth of an old myth to expose their own suffering. Addams eventually came to listen with these women, he writes, and saw herself caught up in the pain and struggle of their plight. This is a form of knowledge that Jane Addams called sympathetic knowledge. It's an understanding that grows through relationships and friendships. Addams said that, quote, the only way of approaching any human problem was to know one another better. To understand what's going on, you have to be connected to them. Their personal and social context has to be something you step into. And this helped Jane Addams, in her social and intellectual work, build a foundation of an ethical philosophy that's really an early form of what's now called the ethics of care. The ethics of care draws lessons from actual relationships, and it allows subtlety and paradox and exceptions to rules that you sometimes have to meet. It honors this rich tapestry of human experience rather than forcing human experience to fit into theories. Care ethics requires empathy and respect for the unique experience of the other person that you can only understand if you get to know the person, if they tell their story. So how do stories transform personal relationships? I've talked about that it's important to tell your story. It's important to listen deeply. But now I want to emphasize a transformational process that occurs when somebody tells a story and somebody else really listens. In my early experience in community service at the high school where I was, I focused mostly on my duty to the students involved and how the program might develop in them a sense of civic responsibility. I also cared about those who were served, both the nonprofits that we visited or the clients that they served. I didn't want to use the people in need simply as a way to nurture good citizens. So what I had to do is learn about a deeper transformation. And what I began to appreciate was that the sense of identity of those who serve and those who are served can be wrapped up in a meaningful ethical relationship. That their individuality can be complemented by becoming embedded in the lives of others. Jane Addams learned this. She learned how to build trust and insight and a deeper relationship with those she served. And she understood that her own identity shifted from being dominated by me to being enriched by us. Her autonomy was not threatened by relationship, but balanced by it. By being willing to be vulnerable and open to people, she became more complete. And it's this transformation that fascinates me. It fascinated me when I saw it in my children. I've spoken here a number of times about a program at the Washington Ethical Society. All three of my kids did it for multiple years, where they went to El Salvador to do a service project. And as all good ethical humanist work does, it started with relationships. My youngest, Justin, wrote about it in a college essay that I accessed this week. And he talked about how his life experience, which included trips to Mexico and Guatemala and Nicaragua, visiting family there, prepared him for this experience in El Salvador, in a town called El Rodeo. And he wrote about how the Ethical Society trip was built on community capacity building and cultural solidarity. Rather than rushing down to El Salvador to say, we know how to fix you and we'll build this for you and then we'll go home, the West Group first got to know the people of Rodeo well. El Rodeo took time to share with them their history and their joy and their pain, particularly the pain of trauma caused by a civil war that in the 1980s killed 75,000 people in a tiny country. We know how much 50,000 deaths of servicemen caused pain in our country. Down there, devastating. And the fact that U.S. policy contributed to that suffering was not lost on the delegation. Caught up in Cold War ideology and a commitment to capitalism over community, basically, our nation prolonged a devastating civil strife that left residents with horrible experiences that they told the delegation in stories. Stories about massacres of entire towns, about 500-pound bombs that created craters all through the landscape, about a hospital without anesthetic where the nurses had to muffle the screams of those being amputated. But by sharing the suffering, their purpose came out of their pain. It transformed the story of the people in El Salvador into one of resilience. And by listening, the Ethical Society delegates became a part of the healing process. And that changed what those stories were. Their relationship became a part of both of them. And just this afternoon, this morning, I was told that the Harvard Psychiatry Department last year said that the single most important therapeutic variable is being listened to. Now, in some ways, for transforming pain, for getting over trauma, in some way, my kids were somewhat traumatized by the stories, clearly. And they had to process it, both during and after their trip to Salvador. But both sides of the relationships, those from the U.S. and from El Salvador, had to be vulnerable for that story to be told. The Ethical Society kids had to be vulnerable in a willingness to listen to it, and the Salvadorans had to be vulnerable in feeling that they could tell their story without their story becoming denied or deflected or manipulated by others. The listeners had to be vulnerable, and they had to listen from their heart for the healing to occur. And in the end, a very deep bond was created between the delegates and their most generous and appreciative host that went on for years and is currently continuing. Those storytellers in El Salvador were able to develop in their story a clearer idea of what needs they had. And out of that, they decided together to create a project that would create regular, clean water for the community. But it was built on those stories. Now, vulnerability, I think, was also a big part of the Humanist Service Corps trips. Christian Hayden went to Ghana on one of those, and I was intrigued when Christian spoke about how he wanted to learn the local language, because he realized, I think, intuitively that any sort of service relationship has to center on communication and sharing and listening and hearing. Organized as part of the Foundation Beyond Belief, this trip to Ghana brought young humanists to an area where many women were being accused of witchcraft and ostracized and isolated in refugee camps. But the stories are part of the healing. Maybe we'll hear more stories. I know you've shared some, Christian. Let's get some more. One of the deepest divisions, however, that occurs in any service situation is between those who have and those who have not. This chasm between a volunteer serving a client can be made worse by a power differential. And as one who is committed to a transformational philosophy of life, I've found that one of the ways to bridge this divide is to listen. To listen especially to those who are silenced by poverty, by oppression, and by loneliness. It's not always practical, I know that. I mean, many of the volunteer opportunities don't include connections directly to the people who need. You'll donate today to Books Behind Bars, but you're not actually going to be able to speak to one of the people that are served or incarcerated. But it does get you closer, at least in your heart and in your imagination. It allows you to imagine connecting to a broader and broader circle of humanity, and all service can do that. As an alternative to traditional religion, ethical culture doesn't offer connection to a divine realm. It offers something simpler and deeper. It brings you closer to being part of a species that embraces the brotherhood and sisterhood and peoplehood of everyone. So I urge you to carry what is a broad and idealistic vision with you wherever life takes you. I encourage you to let you enrich relationships with all of those you connect with, including those you serve and those who serve you. When you help others in need, you give them a great gift if you listen to their story. So whether you're supporting a young relative who's asking you advice, or listening to a service worker explain why you need a living wage in this city, or if you're buying an edition of One Step Away from somebody that happened to have been homeless but is now an editor for that newspaper, or if you're just spending time with a homebound person, open yourself to their story, because it might transform you in ways that surprise you and transform the storyteller, dissolving loneliness, growing connections, nurturing ethical community. Ethical culture leader Ed Erickson put it in his book, The Humanist Way. What we hold out as our ideal before us is the chance to participate in the oneness of humanity. Thank you very much.